Good afternoon and welcome to this AI event. My name is Desmond Lochman and it's my pleasure to welcome you. And it's also my pleasure to welcome the distinguished panelists that we've got for this event on Joe Biden trade policy challenges. In order in which their panel will speak, they are first Anne Kruger, who certainly needs no introduction, being an internationally renowned expert in trade. But I would say that her highly distinguished career has included a period as the World Bank's chief economist and as the International Monetary Fund's first deputy managing director. I should also mention that Anne is the author of many books on trade, including her very recently published book on international trade, What Everyone Needs to Know, which I can strongly recommend as a highly readable account of the major trade issues of today. Following Anne will be Chad Bown, who is currently a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Chad, before that, was a senior economist for international trade and investment in the White House on the Council of the President's Economic Advisors. And most recently, he was a lead economist at the World Bank. Following Chad, we'll have Doug Irwin, who is the John French Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College and Research Associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. He too served on the staff of the President's Council of Economic Advisors and has spent time in the Division of International Finance at the Federal Reserve System. Last but by no means least is my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, Claude Barfield, who is the AEI's trade expert, and he was formerly a consultant to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Just by way of introduction, I should say that one of the defining characteristics of the global economy in the post-war period was the pronounced increase in international trade as countries became more open to trade. This facilitated a prolonged period of unparalleled global economic growth and prosperity, and it allowed hundreds of millions of people in the emerging market economies to be lifted out of poverty. In recent years, however, there's been a marked slowdown in the growth of international trade that has been largely as a result of a political backlash against globalization, and that now is being reinforced by the COVID-19 pandemic. Against this background, I thought that an AI trade event might be timely for a number of reasons. First, we're coming to the end of the Trump administration that has been particularly bad for international trade and globalization. So not only that President Trump has led the United States into a trade war with China and pursued a protectionist American first policy, it was also that he took a singularly unilateral approach to trade policy, and he seemed to go out of his way to undermine multilateral institutions like the World Trade Organization. The second reason I thought that an AI event would be timely was as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The world now is in the midst of its worst health crisis and its deepest economic recession in the past 90 years. And that now poses additional challenges to the maintenance of an open international trading system. The pandemic has raised questions about the stability of global supply chains, and according to the World Trade Organization, it has led to a greater decline in international trade this year than occurred some 10 years earlier in the aftermath of the Great Economic Recession. The third reason I thought that an AI trade event would be timely was that we'll soon be at the start of the Biden administration that will have the chance to adopt a more multilateral approach to trade policy, as well as to reassert the United States' traditional leadership role in the world economy. It also will have the chance to arrest the tide against globalization that has characterized these last few years. However, whether it chooses to do so remains a very open question, considering Mr. Biden's embrace of a Build America Better campaign. I'm delighted that we have a panel of real trade experts to help to help us better understand these issues. And to do so, I'll ask each of these panelists to answer one of four questions. The question that I'll direct to Anne Kruger will be, over the past 4 years, the US has taken a protectionist and bilateral approach to trade matters. What has been the cost of that approach? And what are the prospects that the US will promote globalization and multilateralism under a Biden administration? The question to Chad Brown would be, what should be the Biden administration's priorities in the area of trade policy? And how best should the new administration go about achieving those goals? And what obstacles is it likely to face in that endeavor? To Professor Doug Irwin, I'll raise the question, in framing its trade policy, what lessons might the incoming Biden administration learn from the experience with President Trump's trade policy mistakes? And last, to Claude Barfield, the question will be, the Trump administration has waged a trade war with China, which has accused of taking unfair advantage of the United States in trade matters. What approach should the Biden administration take towards U.S.-China trade relations? So without further ado, I'll ask Anne Kruger to address the question, what has been the cost of Donald Trump's trade policies, and how likely is it that there'll be a change in those policies under Joe Biden? Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Desmond. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to hearing what the others say. We do, as you said, have a bunch of real experts on all of this. What is the cost of the Trump administration? I think it will be years before we know, and I think part of the answer will depend on what the Biden administration does. In my view, Trump has done an awful lot of damage to the trading system in a number of ways, and I'll come back to that. And part of that damage, which is hard to quantify and is hard to pinpoint, is simply the loss of American leadership internationally on trade issues. Now, that leadership has been important on many things, but on trade is particularly important because one of the things that's almost impossible to do is to conduct trade relations only bilaterally. There are too many countries, and each of them has exports and imports, and treating countries one by one leaves a chaos within the world economy. One of the many things we have that worked, that the United States set up after World War II with its leadership and the help of many others, was, of course, first the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which then became the World Trade Organization, which is the international organization with more than 160 members. And in that organization, there have been several things that we need for trade. The WTO members have agreed to having national treatment for the foreign traders in their domestic courts, which is very important because otherwise an importer in a country could go in and say the exporter mischarged me and the exporter couldn't have a fair defense, or vice versa, if it's the exporter who's charging something from the import side. Either way, we need national treatment, we need non-discrimination, meaning between countries alike, and we need some kind of way of resolving disputes and of negotiating reduced tariff barriers. And the WTO did all that and did it very well. Tariffs fell enormously after World War II, which, as you know very well, it was very much a part of why trade expanded as much as it did, which in turn helped economic growth as much as you pointed out. So we've had a system that worked multilaterally, and when there was an issue, it could be resolved within the framework of a multilateral organization. Now, what happened with Trump is he said, no, I'm going to do things unilaterally. He ignored some of the things that the United States had agreed to within the WTO, and in some cases, he simply went around the WTO and tried to act by himself in ways that I don't think worked very well for a whole variety of reasons. Tariffs fell enormously, as I said. There were tariff negotiations. Many countries that had not adopted open trade right after World War II did so because they saw the advantages of it given what happened to other countries. So in a sense, we lost something, and I think we have to get it back. Our leadership was important. There are more than 160 countries, and not each can, so to speak, dominate the agenda at the WTO. So we kind of have to be doing it with leadership, and we lost that because of our behavior, and I think that would be a question to get it back. The costs have been substantial. On what he called national security grounds, and I should add, or I should say that the WTO does permit countries to protect industries for national security reasons. And until the Trump administration, most countries have been pretty honest about that, not doing very much, at least, to protect domestic industries. But under the Trump administration, one of the first things he did was to put a tariff of 25% on iron and steel and 10% on aluminum. And both of those tariffs were basically put on all countries on national security grounds that we needed them for self-preservation or self-defense or national security, whatever you want to call it. The trouble with that was severalfold. One of a major trouble and a serious trouble with it was that that put our exporters at a disadvantage relative to other countries which were importing steel to produce steel using products. A second disadvantage was that our domestic producers had to pay more for their steel, which in turn meant that they, in the domestic market, had to charge more, and that, of course, meant that demand fell, at least in many cases. The argument for doing it was national security, but one of the arguments he gave for it was that we needed jobs in the United States. Well, it turns out that there are about 10 times as many jobs, or even more, in steel-using industries as there are in steel-producing industries. And the best estimate is that we lost maybe 800,000 jobs because of the steel tariffs. Meanwhile, at the time he proposed the steel tariffs, 20% of our steel was imported, and I say only 20%, and only 2% of our entire steel usage was imported from China. And yet on national security grounds, he imposed tariffs on everybody, including Canada, Western Europe, and so on. It doesn't seem to make any sense per se as national security. It doesn't make any sense in terms of economics. It certainly didn't save jobs, and it did not much else. And unless you believe it really was national security, it violated at least the spirit of the understanding in the WTO because we had reduced our tariffs in negotiation with other countries as they had reduced theirs. So for all of those reasons, I think the steel tariffs and the aluminum tariffs are among the first things the President-elect Biden should work on getting reduced back to their earlier levels. The Trump administration was already forced to take them off with regard to Mexico and Canada, which means that Canadian producers have lower costs of steel than American producers because we have the higher cost due to tariffs and so on. So there are a number of reasons to do it. It will not be easy, and it won't happen all at once. We even imposed in our free trade agreement with Korea, with South Korea, not the way around, South Korea, that the tariffs would not be imposed on South Korea, provided that South Korea cut its imports back to 70% of the average level the 3 years before the Trump administration, i.e. 2015, 16, and 17. That was 2014, 15, 16. And that meant that they had to put quotas on their exports of iron and steel to us, which of course meant that they could raise their prices and get the benefit of it, but they had to keep their quantity of steel exported to us very low. That has had cost in terms of our relationships with South Korea. It's had cost in terms of a huge bureaucratic apparatus in the Department of Commerce as they try to administer what tariffs should be waived because the steel can't be produced here. And there have been long delays in getting steel and many complaints about the system from businessmen and steel users and of course even the steel companies themselves. So with all that, I would have said that alone was enough damage to undo, but it's only the beginning. Within the WTO, of course, the Trump administration has not been willing to work cooperatively. It has not come up with proposals for some of the new issues which desperately need international agreement, e-commerce, things like that. Meanwhile, at the same time as it hasn't done all of that, we have a dispute settlement mechanism within the WTO, a 7-member panel appointed with unanimous consent of all members. Since 2017, the Trump administration has approved no new appointments. So right now, there are no judgments whatsoever in a dispute settlement mechanism, which in turn means that no dispute could go and meaningfully be adjudicated through the WTO because there's no mechanism that can be appealed to within it, which is necessary for that purpose. So I would argue that the second thing that has to happen very quickly has to be that we have to, A, recommit to multilateralism, and in so doing, restore the functions as they are, and at the same time, work out a concrete and sensible proposal in coordination with some of our large trading partners to take on some of the new issues that need addressing within the WTO. The third thing I think, of course, is that relations with China have to be improved. And for the most part, I'll leave that to Claude, who I understand is going to speak about it later. The one thing I would say is that Trump did a lot of damage, and what he did not do very much of what he was set out to do. The first thing he set out to do with the Chinese trade war, as it was called, was to make sure, or to try and ensure that the Chinese reduced their bilateral trading deficit with the United States, their surplus, or our deficit with us, at trade account. All economists will agree that the trade deficits aren't bilateral, they're multilateral. Things that used to come from China now come partly from Vietnam, etc., etc. And the reduction in trade, our trade deficit with China is virtually non-existent. Varies a little bit from month to month, but it's not there. But nobody ever thought that could work in the first place, so it's not a reason for doing anything. And it would be much better to take up the issues that we have on intellectual property and things like that with the Chinese multilaterally, with some of the European Union, the UK, Canada, South Korea, Japan, other countries that want to be involved in that, because that's something that two countries by themselves cannot very well do because of all the problems that come about with it. In that connection, though, there's another issue that needs addressing, I think, quite quickly, and that is that just in 2016, the United States, along with others, agreed on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which was to be a free trade area of 12 Asian Pacific nations, including the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, and then around the Pacific Rim, South Korea, Malaysia, Thailand, etc., etc. That was Japan, I forgot to mention, which is important. That was agreed upon, and it was going to be ratified and go into effect. Almost the first action of President Trump was to say, pull us out of that agreement and say we would not go along with it. We are not a member. The other members became the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership for Trade and Investment, and that is in effect. That means that there's free trade between, for example, Japan and Australia, but not between Australia and the United States or Japan and the United States. So that in effect, what happens is that American wheat trying to enter the market of either of those countries pays their external tariff rate, whereas wheat coming from Canada, which is in the Comprehensive and Progressive Trade Partnership, does not pay it. So that in effect, we got Trump to discriminate against our own exports in favor of those of the other 11 countries that remained in it. Now, the 11 countries under the leadership of then Prime Minister Abe did agree to form the partnership. They changed its name. They took out, I think it's 22 articles that had been sort of insisted upon by the U.S. But in so doing, they also said that once that partnership came into effect, they would bring those articles back. Bringing the TPP into effect as quickly as possible, or getting back into it, would be very desirable under almost all costs. I would argue that those are the most essential things. There are lots of others. There's not just that, but there's also factors like the generalized system of trade preferences, which is coming up for renewal, by the way, on December 31st, and which looks as if it's in for trouble because of opposition by the administration. I think that would be a mistake, in part because it's not that important in terms of our trade overall, but it does help a lot of developing countries begin getting into international markets, and it's something that is to our benefit as they become better citizens, better able to trade, and better able to participate in the whole global economy. So I would argue that all of those things need doing, plus many more. There are little things I haven't talked about, but the big things I think are, first off, and most important, restoring multilateralism, removing some of the tariffs that discriminate against our own producers, steel and aluminum being a big case in point, and then restoring our membership in the Asia Pacific group that was agreed to under the Obama administration, although started, I should add, before that, and then basically abandoned by the Trump administration. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that, Anne. And you've really given quite a comprehensive list of items that a Biden administration might do. Let's turn it over to Chad, and maybe you can elaborate, whether or not, that those would be your list in terms of priorities, and maybe, give some indication of how likely you think it is that a Biden administration would move in that direction.
So thanks also for the invitation to be part of this group. I don't think that I disagree much with what Anne laid out there, and I think she did a really wonderful job of basically referring to everything that needs to get done. But essentially, we're now at the point that there's so much that needs to get done. The Biden administration is going to have to think about what their priorities are and what's realistic, and the rest of the world needs to be prepared for that. So I thought maybe I'd walk through 4 priorities under the broad heading of a sort of strategy approach to make trade boring again. So one of the problems, I think, of the last 4 years of the Trump administration is trade just became far too exciting relative to its actual economic importance. And this event is amazing. My colleagues on this panel are amazing, and some of the brilliant thinkers and scholars of this and practitioners of this area over the last 30, 40, 50 years. But you all should not be household names. Trade is just, it's better taken care of when it's not as exciting. And it needs, I guess, to be a lot more truthful, right? We heard essentially all about the negative downside consequences of trade over the last 4 years, with no discussions of the positives. And arguably before that, there was just probably far too much discussion of the positives without talking equally or adequately enough about the costs, the adjustment costs, the distributional impacts. And so I think going forward, what we have to do is to be more realistic, be more honest, and be a little bit more circumspect when we do this. So the question is then, okay, how do we do this? Or how does the Biden administration do this? I think the first thing that they have signaled, which I think is probably a good idea, is that they're going to effectively do that. But they're not going to go off and sign any new deals. They are essentially going to focus on working on, cleaning up their own backyard, investing at home, right? Working on American workers and American companies improving their competitiveness. I think that's an excellent start, provided it doesn't mean an inward look of trade barriers and reshoring and all of that stuff that might come along with it. They haven't so much signaled that. There's been a little bit of talk here and there when we're thinking about maybe critical infrastructure or medicine supply chains, things like that. But for the most part, there hasn't been too much concern. A little bit of Buy America, but aside from that, there hasn't been a broad inward turn, I don't think necessarily. And so I think that's the right approach, recognizing that especially in this post-COVID moment, that has to be the priority of fixing things at home. But that being said, there's going to be a lot taking place out there in the real world that if we aren't engaged, if the United States isn't engaged, let alone showing leadership, it's increasingly going to be left behind. And also there's a number of areas that need to be cleaned up after the sort of 4 years of the Trump administration, either cleaned up or that are still around, fights that have been started that are far from being resolved, that they're going to have to figure out what to do next. And so obviously the first one is, and the big overarching one is China and what to do about China, right? And so again, I think a good strategy to approach would be to make it boring again. It used to be that only folks like us cared about U.S. China trade. And not that didn't lead to problems, but I'm not sure that any of the problems that it led to have been fixed, made better. And I think a lot of it has been made worse by how things have gone over the last 3 or 4 years. So how do we fix the U.S. China relationship? Well, we have this phase 1 agreement. I think partially what we need to do is to reset expectations, to focus on what it is that we are interested in and concerned about with China, which is less its bilateral trade surplus with the United States than its system of economic engagement with the world that we may find troublesome, and trying to figure out and negotiate over where it is that we actually have problems and challenges with the Chinese economic model. And so that is, arguably its system of subsidies, its state-owned enterprises, and areas where those conflict with the United States' system, with the systems that are more broadly shared in the rest of the WTO membership. And the question is, how do you get there? Well, I think there's not much obviously in the phase 1 agreement that tackles those challenges, and there's some problems in the phase 1 agreement that actually go against achieving those sorts of challenges. There's nothing really in there on dealing with state-owned enterprises or subsidies, and the purchase commitments actually kind of create the wrong incentives to try to encourage more reforms in China, more market-oriented behavior, let alone the worry the trading partners have that all that we are concerned about in the United States is China just buying more, shifting their purchases toward us and buying less from the rest of the world. So I think there has to be a reorientation of the U.S. China trade relationship overall, and thinking about what it is that we're concerned about on the economic and trade side that hasn't been addressed over the last 4 years. The broader question of, though, how you do that, I think it's also become increasingly clear that the United States going after this alone, unilaterally, negotiating with China bilaterally, just is not going to work. When the main concerns with China are on, these systemic issues of subsidies, it's SOEs, we're not the only ones that are concerned with this, right? The Europeans, the Japanese, they all share in the same concerns. They all should therefore share part of the burden of working together to address the challenges that China poses. And so far, they've been left on the sidelines. So I think, a second strategy, and the President-elect Biden has, I think, even articulated this, that the approach would be to work with allies to address the common concerns with China. So the question is, well, how do you actually go about doing that? And this is where, cleaning up some of the mess of the last couple of years comes in. So what do you do about the lingering steel and aluminum tariffs, which at the moment aren't, for the most part, hitting imports from China, but that are targeting trade with our allies? What do you do? How do you clean those up? How do you resolve those sorts of issues? How do you resolve the ongoing bilateral irritants that are, been there for decades, Boeing, Airbus? WTO reform, right? And talked about this. This is obviously a huge priority for the European Union, this very multilateralist, entity and body in and of itself. We've sort of pulled out the rug from underneath the EU, let alone in the bilateral relationship, but what underpins its relationship with the rest of the world. And this is a huge priority for it, and us recognizing that, I think, should be important. That being said, unfortunately, restoring WTO dispute settlement is not going to solve any bigger problems that we have with anyone in the world right now. It's a good long-term thing to do, but a Biden administration is going to recognize that even if they fixed WTO dispute settlement on day one, any disputes that they might initiate, that they might lodge, wouldn't get resolved for 3 or 4 years. And so really kind of isn't the way to achieve some of the most pressing, challenging concerns. So that's only, I think, one of a part of things that are going to need to get done. But those things are going to need to get done if ultimately you are going to get the European Union, Japan, and these other economies to engage with the United States to address the common challenges with China. So Anne mentioned there was this trilateral initiative that the Trump administration undertook with Europe and Japan to try to work out new rules for industrial subsidies. Things like that, I think, are the way forward, and hopefully a Biden administration would be anxious to pick up. But then the last thing on my list of what I think they're going to have to do and do differently is to recognize that the world is moving on as well. And there's just a number of trade issues that are going to end up in its lap that it can't put to the side. And these include things like the digital services tax, that are happening out there around the world. The OECD process for, kind of coming up with multilateral rules on corporate taxation haven't evolved yet. They're going to have to engage with that relatively quickly. And then obviously the European Union has been biding its time to roll out its climate agenda, which could very well have as an important component in there, border carbon adjustment taxes. And so if the United States is not willing to engage on that sort of issue relatively soon, and the Biden administration has signaled that climate is going to be a priority by appointing Senator Kerry to sort of head that initiative for the incoming administration. They sent the signal of that very early on, but they're going to need to engage on that and deal with it proactively, lest the United States and American exporters become the target of these sorts of tariffs that other countries impose. So I think whether they want to engage on trade, they said they don't want to do any new deals until they clean the United States up at home. But I think that being said, there's going to be a number of issues that they're going to have to engage on relatively early on. And hopefully at least this sets out some of the path forward that they might undertake to get there in a not too uncoordinated way. And if they don't, things could get messy in a hurry. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chad. You mentioned a couple of themes that they might look at. You mentioned that we need to be more honest about the distributional effects of trade. I guess what you're talking about is wage stagnation and that you've got winners and losers, and how do you compensate the losers in trade. You also mentioned this American build it better, that they might be concentrating on that. My question is, with those kind of concerns, are you optimistic that a Biden administration is going to move in a very much more free trade direction, or are there forces, within the Democratic Party that are going to limit the amount that they can do? You've mentioned that they're not going to get into new trade agreements like TPP, but I'm just wondering the general thrust of their policy. Is this likely to repeat in any way the American first approach that we've seen the last 4 years?
So I don't think so, but I agree with you entirely that they have sent signals that at least for certain areas, and I think that the two areas of sort of common agreement that they might share with the Trump administration are worries about technology. And so, we've seen the Trump administration roll out all of these export controls on semiconductors and equipment increasingly over the last year or so, and dealing with the technology conflict with China that's going to be impacting trade there, but then also on medical supplies. And I think the broader concern is that, what we have seen play out during the pandemic was not ideal. In many respects, trade has been great, and hopefully more about this, but trade is going to be very, very important on the health side to get us out of the pandemic, given that vaccines are only going to be able to be produced in a handful of countries. It's going to have to be through trade, compulsory licensing, and everybody producing vaccines locally is not going to work to make everybody healthy around the world. We're going to need to keep trade open to make that work. But that being said, the global allocation of the production of basic medical supplies, PPE, at the beginning of the pandemic sort of revealed that this was not optimal, right? That all of the excess capacity in the world seemed to reside in China. And then when the health shock hit there first, and the demand shock hit there, they sopped up all of that capacity. That left really nothing else for anybody else. And so we saw panic in Europe first and in the United States and export controls. There has to be something done, I think, a bit differently to prevent that allocation, that outcome from repeating itself again, let alone the fact that it's kind of awkward to be relying on this one country for your health needs when at the same time you're discriminating against it at best, if you want to frame it like that, in terms of tariffs, or fighting a trade war with it, in sort of Trumpian language. So I think something there is going to need to be done to resolve those sorts of issues and to improve upon the resiliency in the health space that may not be free trade. But we'll have to see how that plays out. But I don't necessarily think that's going to necessarily spill over to, sort of the rest of economic activity. At least I think initially I wouldn't be surprised if it were just kind of, isolated and limited to those areas.
Great. Thank you, Chad. Let's move on to Doug. And the question for you was, what can the Biden administration learn from the Trump mistakes?
Right. Well, thank you very much, Desmond, for the invitation to appear on this panel. I'd say there are three things that I would focus on in terms of lessons that the Biden administration or a future administration can take away. The first one is simply that you have to align your objectives with the right policy instruments. So, the Trump administration came in, they wanted to reduce the trade deficit. They wanted to end non-reciprocal market access. They want to help domestic manufacturing, to reshore manufacturing, create jobs. So, as economists, we sort of say, okay, you state what your policy objective is, and we'll help you in terms of the right policy approach to achieve that objective. Of course, we can always question those objectives in themselves. But there's a contradiction in terms of the way they tried to handle those objectives and even across those objectives. So if an administration wants to reduce the trade deficit, okay, we can argue about whether that should be its priority, but if you want to do so, tariffs are not going to accomplish that goal. So Joe Gagnon at the Peterson Institute has a couple of nice papers very recently on what approaches a country might take if it wanted to reduce its current account deficit, including you might worry about foreign exchange reserve accumulation in other countries, or stance of fiscal policy, or things of that sort. There are things that one could do, but once again, tariffs wouldn't be the way in which you could approach that. The second objective, reciprocal market access. So the president in particular and his trade representative would complain about tariffs are higher in the EU on certain products. You can always pick and choose, of course, products and find other countries with higher tariffs. And once again, one can debate about actually, the level of EU tariffs and Japan's tariffs are actually very comparable to the US overall. But let's say that you were concerned about the unevenness of tariffs in certain countries. Well, then you think the solution would be a free trade agreement, because then everyone brings their tariffs down to zero. It doesn't necessarily mean that you should start a trade war with them or start picking individual product categories to complain about their higher tariffs. It's a very slow, inefficient, and ultimately unproductive way of approaching things. In terms of the trade-off here, this played out, I think, in terms of the renegotiation of NAFTA. So, one of the complaints that the president had about NAFTA is we had these trade deficits. And yet, in terms of the renegotiation, first of all, the renegotiation wasn't going to help you in terms of those bilateral trade deficits. In addition, there was a problem in identifying if you really believe that reciprocal market access is something that you wanted, then there wasn't actually a problem with NAFTA because the tariffs were zero. So, the question is, what was the purpose of the renegotiation? And so there was this misalignment of what their objectives were and what the policy instruments were. Then, of course, in terms of reshoring jobs and helping out manufacturing, once again, tariffs were the inappropriate way to approach that. One can debate, and we should debate about whether it's a reasonable objective to try to help out the steel industry. But certainly with those tariffs, as Anne pointed out, it's not helping manufacturing overall. There are a number of studies that talk about the raising of cost downstream steel using industries and how we lost more jobs there than we gained in the steel sector itself. We led to a lot of blowback in terms of retaliation against the United States, moving outside of WTO rules with the national security exemption, things of that sort. So once again, if it's the objective of policymakers to help the steel industry, tariffs are not going to be the way of doing it. So most broadly, I think the misalignment of their objectives, which once again we could debate, but in particular the ways in which they tried to achieve those objectives. The second lesson I think that might be helpful is that I think it's much better to have a constructive trade policy rather than a destructive trade policy. So time and again, we heard complaints from the administration about, NAFTA is the worst trade agreement ever. The TPP is a very bad trade agreement. We don't want to be in that. WTO, the dispute settlement system, isn't working. And what was the initial reaction is, well, let's pull out. Let's pull out of NAFTA. Let's pull out of the WTO. Let's pull out of the TPP. Of course, they only pulled out of the TPP, and I think we might agree that that is not completely off the table, that was a precipitous decision that was made without much thought or strategy. But there was the threats about the other two. Well, once again, if there's a problem with NAFTA, identify the problem and correct it. If there's a problem with the WTO and the dispute settlement system, don't just say, the system doesn't work for us, it's rigged against us. Put on the table concrete proposals to improve the system. If the problem was with the TPP, then you say, well, these are the provisions that we need rewritten. Here's our objective that we want to achieve that's not in the current agreement, rather than just walk away from it. So I think being constructive, first of all, I think you're more likely to achieve your objectives, and you're more likely to not lead to the blowback that trade wars give you. I'm reminded of in 1992, I believe it was, of then Vice President Al Gore debated Ross Perot on Larry King Live on CNN over NAFTA. So it's a debate that we've been having for a long time as a country. And Ross Perot said, who opposed NAFTA, said, I think we need some sort of NAFTA type arrangement, but this is just a terrible deal. And Al Gore basically silenced him by saying, right in the first 5 minutes, what would you change? What would you change in NAFTA to make it the agreement that you would like? And Ross Perot really didn't have an answer. And I think when you look at this is sort of also gets back to my first point about aligning objectives with instruments. What was the objective? What was the problem with NAFTA? If you look at the trade negotiating objectives that came out of USTR when they went into it, the number one objective was to reduce the trade deficit among the three partners. The number 2 objective was to preserve existing market access for our farmers and our manufacturers. So the second objective was already achieved in the first NAFTA in terms of basically zero tariffs with a few exceptions. And the first objective was, once again, couldn't be achieved by higher tariffs. So you need to be constructive if you want to engage your trading partners and move the ball in the direction that you want. And the last one is, I think future administrations need a strategy. You need to think out what exactly it is that you want. I think the Trump administration had many instincts, many reactions to things, but I don't think there was sort of a broad conception about what it is, what our priorities are, what we want to achieve. Renegotiating KORUS, the U.S. agreement with Korea, was that really a really top objective? China, there's been much more reaction to China with the 301 tariffs rather than really thinking through the difficult, what is it, can we realistically achieve? Can we really change the whole nature of the Chinese Communist Party and their involvement in the economy? Or is it the trade deficit? What exactly do we want to achieve, and what are the limits of our power? And what is our strategy for doing that? When you talk about strategy, you need to, first of all, think things through. You also need allies and partners. And this is something that Chad pointed out. Going it alone is probably not going to be an effective strategy. You do want leverage, a term that the president likes a lot. You do need leverage, but I think you increase your leverage if you have countries working alongside you. So when I sort of reflect on these 3 things, the fact that you need to align the objectives and instruments, you need to be constructive in how you're approaching the various agreements and the challenges facing us, and you need a strategy that sort of ties it all together. I'm reminded of Robert Baldwin, a professor at the University of Wisconsin, who wrote a wonderful paper called The Inefficacy of Trade Policy. And what he meant by that is that tariffs are rarely going to help you achieve the kinds of things that we desire in terms of outcomes, whether it's helping out particular sectors of the economy, whether it's trying to get other countries to open their markets. And so that's, I think, the one lesson the broad lesson that I would take away, that we've had a lot of tariffs on the Trump administration. But I think when you go down the list of what they were trying to achieve with those tariffs, very little was achieved. And unfortunately, that gets back to Ann's point about how much damage has been done over the past 4 years.
Thank you very much, Doug. I couldn't agree with you more, that tariffs isn't the way one's going to solve trade imbalances. But a question that I'd have is, it seems that the United States in the past has had a problem with a country like Germany's trade surplus, and these trade surpluses and deficits are driven more by the question of how much does the country save, how much does it invest. The saving investment balance is pretty critical in that. I would have thought that one of the outcomes of this COVID-19 recession, the way in which we're responding to it, what we're going to see is widening in those trade balances going forward. My question is, do you think that is going to be a source of concern, for a Biden administration? And the other question I'd have is, do you think a Biden administration is very clear in what their objectives are, in the trade policy field?
Well, in terms of the trade deficits, I haven't looked at the most recent figures for the past 6 months or so, and I'm not sure I'd be very able to forecast what's going to happen to the current account balances over the next year or so. But I think what was sort of ironic about the Trump administration's fixation on the trade deficit is that after the Great Recession in 2009, where we had, going into that, we did have a rather large, by historical standards, current account deficit. The U.S. has had a current account deficit about 2 to 2.5% of GDP, and it was basically flat since 2009. So it wasn't growing the way it was in the early 80s or the mid 1990s, when arguably, one could debate whether that should be a concern or not. It was sort of a non-issue in some sense. So I think if we're going into the 2020s and the current account deficit is stable to 2.5% of GDP, then I don't think it should be a priority for any administration. The Wall Street Journal had an editorial a number of years ago where they said the best way to think about the trade deficit is not to think about it. I've always found that very amusing. And, in some circumstances, maybe we would want to worry about it, but not if it's relatively low and stable. It shouldn't be a priority. But if it is a priority, once again, as you pointed out, the policy instruments are not tariffs. You have to worry about fiscal policy, accumulation of foreign exchange by foreign central banks and things of that sort. So that would be a Treasury IMF sort of issue. On the second point about whether the Biden administration has a strategy, I'm heartened by their foreign policy experts, but of course they have yet to announce their trade team. So just to put in a plug for Dartmouth, Jake Sullivan, the incoming national security advisor, visited Dartmouth for a little over a year and taught some courses to great acclaim from all the students, and it was great to interact with him. And he certainly has a strategy in mind. So that I think is a sign of optimism, sign for optimism.
Great. Thank you. I just add that in terms of the Trump administration, if they were concerned about current account deficits and surpluses, China wasn't the right place to go, because it just happened that Germany had a very much larger trade surplus. Certainly in relative terms, it was something like 8% of GDP, whereas China was running something like 2% of GDP. So it looked like not only did they have the wrong policies, but they were going after the wrong country if that was really what their objective was. But with that, let's go to Cloud and see what Cloud's thinking about what the Biden administration should be doing with China.
Thank you very much, Des, and thanks for inviting me. And it's, as I said before we went on, it's really good to see my colleagues after all these months. There are a number of things that one could say, and about because of the multiplicity of issues that have come up and are on the table for the Biden administration in relation to China. And Chad, and to some degree, Ian, set me really up for things that I'm not going to talk about, at least initially, and that is, I agree with him. I agree with Chad about the fact that we certainly need allies, and I'll come back to this, in any set of policies we have, whether they're trade policies or more broadly diplomatic policies in dealing with China. And I agree with Ann that where we can, I think we should not give up on the World Trade Organization. But what I want to talk about in my time is what I think now, at least in relation to U.S. and China, and possibly with other countries, but certainly with U.S. and China, and that is the nexus between trade on the one hand and security policy and human rights policy on the other. Now, the trade and issues are not new to the trade regime. We've had trade and environment for several decades, trade and labor. But I think there are a number of really difficult issues that the Biden administration will inherit from the Trump administration, some of which were ill-advised policies, but some of which I think the Biden administration is going to have to think carefully before they either change or stop. I would say this as another point, at least preliminarily. I deferred to my colleagues Nick Averstadt and Derek Scissors, and Nick Lardy over at Peterson, and Scott Kennedy at CSIS about the internal dynamics of the Chinese economy, where it's going, where it is, how strong it is, where the weaknesses are. But one thing I think that the Biden administration will inherit is Xi Jinping and the Chinese the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party have the bit in their teeth. They think that time and history is on their side. And I'll come back to this at the end, but just when one looks at the way that the Chinese have treated the Australians over the last few months, it shows you the combination of trade, security, and the push for authoritarian views that is now to the fore when dealing with China. Let me say at the beginning, I know that national security can be overused. I am very much aware of Samuel Johnson's that national security defense is the last argument of a scoundrel. And it is also true that the Trump administration has debased national security as a concept in terms of broader policy goals, and indeed prostituted it, as others have noted, in terms of trading off clear national security issues with such things as tariffs or quotas. But there are national security issues, there are human rights issues that are valid no matter what how the Trump administration handled it. And I'm going to go through a few things that the Trump administration did, and it'll be interesting to see how the Biden administration actually reacts to this. And I think the other thing is that you see with the Trump administration, but you could see with other administrations, that there's always an interconnection of motives between national security on the one hand, economic security / and then trade policy on the other hand. And just in terms of let me walk through just a couple of incidents or a couple of things that the Trump administration did. From my perspective, actually, in terms of the trade security nexus, what the Trump administration did in terms of cutting off semiconductors to Huawei, one could disagree about which particular semiconductors, and I know Chad has written about this, is where you have the most valid, it seems to me, reason for action that has trade implications. And I am someone who started writing about Huawei 7 or 8 years ago. And I was initially quite scornful of the Bush and then the Obama administration in terms of what their claims about Huawei or the fears about Huawei. The Economist at one point wrote a piece saying that a House intelligence report that came out in 2012 seemed to have been made for not for people who ate meat because there was no meat in it. And I agreed with that. The change in my view has come actually as the technology has changed and wireless technology has changed. And so that in my view, I think it would be dangerous for the United States and for the Western allies to allow Huawei to have or supply or be the only or the major supplier of baseline equipment for 5th generation wireless. So there, I think, is something that I would agree with the administration about. When you get to other things, it's going to be interesting to see the administration using, as I think Chad mentioned, export controls, CFIUS, or just unilateral executive orders has intervened to sanction Chinese companies. They've sanctioned Chinese companies, for instance, in relation to what has happened in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. They have gone farther, and you go farther out in terms of tying trade to security and sanctioning other companies who have supplied surveillance equipment. And in the last months, they've also then expanded that to sanctioning Chinese companies that have aided China, of all things, in the South, in its moves in the South China Sea. And then finally, I think in the last couple of weeks, they actually intend sanctions for companies that quote, aided the Chinese military. Now, when you get that far out, it seems to me, you could have swept in almost any Chinese company. But you are still, I think, in those areas, at least there is the patina of what begins as a national security rationale, though one could disagree about the use of a sanction against a particular company or particular set of companies to fulfill that national security goal. Where I think, and written about this, where I think things get stickier is to go back to Huawei. The United States is not only sanctioning, not only stopping our companies and allied the companies that are either allied companies or U.S. companies that have locations in other countries, not only with Huawei in terms of 5G, but they're also semiconductors that relate to smartphones. There, it seems to me, and what this is an industrial policy intervention, which really, it seems to me, aids companies in other countries, either in this country with Apple or other countries like Korea and Samsung. And I think there things get a bit much more difficult. And then finally, and here I should refer to my colleague Derek Scissors, last week had a policy brief in which he argued that and very carefully in terms of his conclusions, but he argued that U.S. investment in China, particularly portfolio investment, is becoming dangerous. And he made the point that we really don't know how much there is because so much of this is in the Cayman Islands and hidden in other places. But it is also true, I had been thinking about this and writing a bit about this before, that you forget with TikTok and other Chinese companies, for instance, TikTok, the major investments in TikTok, these companies, and are not Chinese companies, they're portfolio investors from the United States and other places. Now, Derek's point, and he was very careful about this, but this is sort of where thinking is to some degree, is that it may very well be in the future that the United States will have to consider restricting outward investment. I think that's one of the things that he was very careful in terms of that we certainly are not there yet, and we don't know enough yet. But my only point here is in going through through this list is to go down a scale as you start with national security or human rights, and then your goal, your tactic is a trade one, and then you get into areas that are very difficult, it seems to me. It's going to be interesting to see how the Biden administration handles this. Will it withdraw sanctions on Chinese companies in relation to the support of the military or support of human rights abuse in Hong Kong? But these are not, I think, easy questions to answer. And I also think while I'll come to this at the end, it is something the United States has done. It would be good, but I think it would be difficult to get other nations to come on board, and though they might come on board with the Hong Kong, but in terms of other things in relation to the Chinese military, that might not be so easy with Europe or Japan or others. And then finally, just a note, I think to go back to the point I made or alluded to about Australia. Until quite recently, what is going on between Australia and China was kind of under the radar. I mean, in the last week, and certainly the last weekend, there was an editorial in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times has picked up on this, and the Economist. The broad implications of what the Chinese are doing in relation to Australia really are something we should pay a lot of attention to. As most of you probably, many of you probably know, certainly, I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail here. The Chinese are really, were really upset. They have been upset, but they didn't take all these actions until the last few months about the Australians saying that Huawei could not be a part of the 5G rollout. And the Australians did not accuse the Chinese of anything. They did, as everyone knows, suggest that there be an international investigation. In return for this, the Chinese have unilaterally put tariffs and restrictions on major Australian goods, on wine, on all kinds of commodities, agricultural commodities. And Australia, and the key here is that China, and this is true with other countries in Asia and to some degree around the world, is by far Australia's #1 trading partner. 1/3 of Australian exports go to China. And the final thing was as again, it may be well known, but just to note this, the so-called 14 grievances that the Chinese had published against Australia. These grievances were to some degree economic, but by and large, they actually were an attempt to force Australia to cut or undercut its own academics, its own newspapers, its own public opinion, that anything that went against China. And the argument was that this is what we put on the table, and it's not just a question of a trade agreement. This is what we want you to do in terms of us trading with you. So I think this mixture of political issues and security issues with trade issues is going to be important going forward. And I think it's one of the most difficult things I think the Biden administration will have to deal with. I should say, by the way, that maybe they knew that we were having this session today, because some of you may know that yesterday, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China, Mr. Wang Yi, gave a big speech to the U.S. China Business Council, in which he went over, it was a classic Chinese thing, Chinese speech, in the sense of there's all this business at the beginning and throughout about we need to talk, we need dialogue, we need et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, it was very clear that we also don't need you to be talking about Hong Kong or Xinjiang or other things that are internal matters for China. So this combination, as I say, to repeat myself now, is going to be, I think, one of the most difficult, this combination of trade and security, trade and human rights can be one of the most difficult things I think the Biden administration will have to handle. Thank you.
No, thank you, Claude. Before I go to a question that I've got coming in from outside, let me ask you, with your view of China, it seems that what you're doing is you're portraying China as not so much being viewed as an economic partner, but more as a strategic threat. And it seems that what you're saying is that the view that the United States have might not be shared by its partners. So my question is, does this really mean that the United States, in dealing with China under Biden administration, is likely to continue doing so in a unilateral way, not teaming up with its partners? Is that where you think you're going?
If I conveyed that, I didn't mean to. There are certain issues that I think the United States may have to act on its own. But I do think, and let me be very clear here, that I do think, and I thought I was at the end of my time, so I didn't go into this. I do think that the United States should seek to build on the European-Japan trilateral agreement, which the Trump administration played around with, but it never really spent a lot of political capital on it. So I'm very much in favor of that. I just think that there are some things that are going to be very difficult. I am, we've had a lot, and I've written that others, some of these on the panel we've had a lot of discussion, because you've got a new administration coming in, of a reset of relations between the United States and Europe. And I'm certainly all for that. And the economists and others have talked about a grand bargain, which we compromise on issues related to digital. But I think it's not going to be as easy as we think, though the Chinese are doing everything to make it easier, I would say, because particularly in the digital area, there are major issues. The European, at least some of the European Commission, is committed to trying to have what they call technological sovereignty, and to going against what is the perception now. There's some of this over here in the United States, let me say, against the unfair business practices of big tech. So there are different, as I think you, or maybe it was Chad, or someone mentioned, the digital taxes. We've got differences on privacy issues. I hope with the new administration, we'll be able to work something out. But certainly, and again, hopefully, at least in terms of getting the alliance forward, any negative move or set of negative moves or belligerent moves, the so-called wolf diplomacy of the Chinese that they make, I think will help us along in terms of pulling together some kind of alliance between the United States and other allies, particularly the Europeans.
Great. Let me pose a question, to the panel. We'll go through each speaker individually, and I'd also like to give the speakers an opportunity to react to anything that another panelist has said. But the question goes to the whole nature of globalization, and the question being asked is, whether or not globalization has had deleterious effects on large portions of the American working class. And I guess that's what the question really is asking is, should we see trade, through factor price equalization or what have you, having had an effect on wages in the United States, kept them pretty compressed? And that's part of the reason that we're seeing a strong backlash against globalization. But I wonder whether you'd like to start, and then we go around to the other panelists.
Okay, I take it I have two assignments. One is the what this trade done for the real wages of the workers, and the other is reactions, and I'll try and take both quickly. As to real wages and workers, I think most of the analyses that have been done would say that the big changes in the labor market relative to wages and capital have come about because of technical change. The technical change has been by far larger in impact on substituting capital for unskilled labor, etc., than has trade. Trade has had an effect, I'm not saying that, but the larger effect is that. And if you think overall, before COVID, our unemployment rate was less than 4%. We cannot have had a tremendous effect on labor as a whole. We certainly had effects on labor in terms of particular towns or cities or places where indeed company or companies were focusing on producing things that were greatly challenged by imports because there was a lot of unskilled labor content and wages are higher here. The obvious answer to me is that we should have a program that handles people who lose their jobs and assists them in relocating and re-educating or whatever across the board. It's impossible to say whose job was lost because they automated and whose job was lost because of this and that. We even talk about moving factories overseas. But sometimes if you didn't move that factory overseas, you'd lose the whole business because it would move to Malaysia, whereas instead only the very unskilled labor part does, and it then enables the company to compete with other companies that cannot access the international market. So while trade is a factor, I think it's not the main factor, and while policies are needed to address it, to address the needs of the people who are displaced, I don't think the trade policy is or should be a major one of those policies for that purpose. So in that sense, I agree with that. I want to make one other point, though, that goes particularly to China and cuts across what several people said and what I meant to say but didn't have time, and I thought maybe Claude would cover it. Doug came to part of it too, saying, what are your objectives? Well, it seems to me the objective with regard to China, as it has been articulated in the press at least, has been plain wrong. The trade is the objective should not be that we're mad at China, we want to confront China, we want to stop them doing things. The problem, I think, should be reformulated. Is okay, here's a rising country. No matter what we do, it's going to rise. Let's see where there are common interests, where there are things they want, where there are things there. How can we handle it best in terms of reaching agreements that this transition goes as best it can? I don't say that means it will go smoothly, I'm sure it won't. But on the other hand, to start with a trade war, to slap those tariffs on and do things that way, seemed to me to be exactly the procedure that would make the Chinese react most defensively and most reactively by retaliation and other things, and have least effect in terms of achieving what I think should be the objectives, which are enabling China or getting China to enter into, if you like, the global economy in a way that makes sense for them and makes sense for the world as a whole, rather than how we will have this confrontational thing where everything is bash China. And I think that's important in terms of talking about trade policy, because I do not think that you can completely separate trade policy from national security, from geopolitical issues, from other things. And if you try to do so, you're in trouble. And on the other hand, even if a trade war made sense, which it didn't, if a trade war made sense, it certainly didn't make sense in terms of national security issues and other things of great importance. I'll stop there.
Chad, would you like to weigh in and perhaps indicate whether you think sufficient is being done? Anne mentions you need to retrain workers and so on. That it just seems that not enough is being done for those who are losing out from trade.
Yeah, I mean, so we saw no progress on this over the last 4 years, and I think we'll have to wait and see what the Biden administration's approach on this would mean, right? So they've talked about investing in the American workers, but ultimately it's going to take actually seeing what the policies are to know if they're engaging on these big distributional issues that I think are so important. One thing I wanted to weigh in on was what Claude was talking about on some of the national security nexus challenges that we're now confronting, because I couldn't agree more with some of the points that he's made. But I want to kind of push it even further to kind of show really, the work that we have cut out for us, that has now come up. And so I think the semiconductors is a fantastic story, and it kind of showcases the limits of the existing institutional structures that we have to deal with these challenges, right? So let's take as given that maybe Huawei is a national security threat, and we want to try to cut off semiconductors, from access to them. Okay, so the way the administration did this was first it rolled out export controls and said to American companies, you can't sell semiconductors that we manufacture to Huawei anymore. So that's fine, but the problem is it didn't work, because a lot of the semiconductors that even American companies make aren't manufactured in the United States. They have this business model where they give the technology, they license the technology to these fabs in other countries, and they make it and sell to China, right? So you have this massive fab in Taiwan, TSMC, or competitors, Samsung, South Korea, that even with these kinds of export controls, didn't even work at protecting national security because while we could still access the technology, the semiconductors from these alternative sources. So then what they do, and it's, it's sort of genius economically, at least in the short term, is they say, well, what do all these fabs actually need, regardless of where they are around the world, to create semiconductors? They need American inputs. So they need software and they need the capital equipment that it just so happens that companies in the United States are the ones that manufacture and that sell to them. And without those things, they're not going to be able to continue to make these semiconductors. And instead of going to, the Taiwanese government or the South Korean government and saying, look, we think there are these national security concerns here. You should be concerned as well. Why don't you impose the same sort of export controls? We'll do this sort of as a multilateral approach. They went right after the firms and said, hey, you private firms in these countries, you can't have access to the American equipment anymore if you want to sell semiconductors to Huawei. So it's either us or it's them. And so we'll see, as a strategy, we'll see if it works this time around. But I think in a governance world, when we're thinking about multilateralism and coordination of sort of like-minded countries and allies, this probably isn't a sustainable strategy. And that's very much because we don't have a good set of multilateral institutions to deal with these questions of national security and export controls. Right? There is this thing, the Wassenaar Arrangement that's out there, but it was very much designed to deal with non-proliferation issues and not these kind of targeted export controls that kind of are much more reminiscent of the world, the sort of COCOM world of the Cold War in the Soviet Union. But even there, right, there's some differences today that I'm not sure that it's quite parallel. So in any case, if we're thinking about this as a major front on trade, this national security nexus, we also don't have even the basic institutions multilaterally to be able to coordinate with like-minded countries and allies to be able to talk and work together on these issues. So we have a lot of work cut out for us, I think, and there's the potential for, I think, real conflict ahead unless we start to engage on this.
Thank you. Doug, would you like to weigh in?
No, I don't really have too much to add. I guess I just reinforce what Ann said about the trade and wages. I guess the one point I'd make is that yes, there was a ramp up of U.S. imports from China in the 1990s and 2000s, so-called China shock, but we're more than a decade past since then. And I think the U.S. economy is going through this massive transformation in terms of moving to a digital economy where retail is imploding, changing. So we have a lot of challenges looking forward. I think we shouldn't be looking back and trying to say, let's save some manufacturing jobs as a result of trade. What's going on in the steel industry is an example of this. 1980s, it took 10 worker hours to produce a ton of steel. Now it takes 1 worker hour to produce a ton of steel. We're not going to, there's a saying that, if we try to protect the jobs of the past, we're going to lose the jobs of the future. Trying to ramp up domestic steel production is a way of saving a lot of jobs. There are just not as many jobs behind each ton of steel as there were decades ago. And that's ignoring all the forces that are driving us in a new technologically advanced way into the 21st century. So the solutions there are very difficult and problematic, but I think focusing on the future rather than the past is the way to go.
Yeah, but nonetheless, you'd see that there are risks that you do get a backlash against globalization if you don't do something to address the distributional effects.
But I think the distributional effects are much broader than trade. If you look at the wealth creation on the coasts and the difficulties in the Midwest, I think relatively few of those difficulties in the Midwest have to do with trade per se. So that's where, once again, one can be cautiously optimistic about the Biden administration at least speaking about investing in the US and trying to create incentives or some mechanism of creating jobs and getting firms to move to parts of the country that have not shared in the benefits. I must say California is helping this process. With a lot of high-tech firms moving to Texas or elsewhere. So the regulatory state in California, in some sense, is facilitating, perhaps inadvertently or unintentionally, the movement out of California to elsewhere in the country.
Claude.
This is not my bag, as it were, but the only thing I would say that I haven't seen much about this, and this is maybe my failing, but I think one of the things that always attracted me some years ago, was the fact that people who argued that you really should not separate out the assistance you give for workers that allegedly lost their jobs because of trade from workers who lose their job for any other reason. And that we ought to fold these programs together. You ought not to have trade adjustment assistance, but you should decide what level of public support we should have, or what programs we should have for workers who lose their jobs, whether they lost their job because a company went from Massachusetts to Texas, or it went, excuse me, went from Massachusetts to South Korea. So that seems to me would be one place to start. The reason it's hung on and been so bad, I think, the Republicans didn't want to do anything about it. They didn't like it that much. So they didn't want to change it. And the Democrats were afraid that if they lost trade adjustment system, there wouldn't be something that would replace it. So we've been hung in that unfortunate position for some years.
Wait, I've just got two questions. I guess they're my own, but we could perhaps go around the panel. The first is we've got Brexit occurring, December 31st. It doesn't look like these negotiations are going in a great way. It seemed that the British really were relying on getting a very favorable trade deal, free trade deal with America. I would just be curious what your view is as to a Biden administration. I think some of you have said that Biden administration's not looking to do any free trade deals, let alone a special free trade deal for Britain. The second question I have is just to get your view on what this COVID-19 pandemic might have done to the outlook for trade. And specifically, one of the problems, at least initially, was that there was a lot of interruption of supply chains. And I just wonder whether one could expect to get some kind of reaction that one's really not going to want to be that dependent on supply chains to individual countries. To have the whole of the supply chain break down if you get some sort of incident occurring. So I don't know whether you'd like to tackle those, Anne.
Right. Two questions in very little time. On Brexit, I think the odds are that we will not see an outcome, although obviously they're still negotiating and trying. Obviously, if they do not have an outcome on Brexit with Europe, it's going to be very difficult for the Brits to do other things before they negotiate their new status within the WTO and things like that. So in a sense, I think that from the British side, there will be some obstacles to going forward. Meanwhile, I think President-elect Biden has said that he's not going to enter into any of that until some other issues are handled first. So in that sense, I think that we're going to see a point where, at the moment, neither the demand nor the supply will be there right away for it. And there are stumbling blocks anyway, a big one of which, of course, is the U.S. posture on agriculture. The UK must open up completely. The UK posture is that that's the last thing the world will do. That when you start with that kind of obstacles in the sense of where the UK's trade policy is generally, we have a new administration, and then you take the substantive problems as well. I think it will be very difficult to consider going very much further with anything US-UK until a lot of other things, including UK, EU, and UK WTO, is sorted out. As to the COVID issue, I've been a little bit surprised by this discussion because I've been looking at the GTA, this global trade report that is put out by St. Gallen University and the European Policy Studies Group. And they are showing that the trade in medicinal things went up and export controls were relaxed in more countries, and there were import controls put on in others. So it is not at all clear to me. I've been meaning to look at that more closely than I have so far, but it seems to me that so far, on the basis of the stuff I've looked at superficially, it is not clear how that cuts out worldwide in terms of things. It's true that China had a large share of a lot of the PPE and stuff, but that large share was on the, I think the biggest thing was face masks. And that was, I think, 50% of world exports, not world production, but world exports. And 50% of something that's easily buildable in a new factory is not as huge as one might think. It does seem to me that there's been for a long time conventional wisdom within the business community that you don't never want to depend on one supplier or one place completely. So I think that was always there, even if it was not always abided to, and I think it will be abided to more, no doubt about it. But whether COVID will convince us that we gained a lot because of trade in various medicinal related things, which I think we did, or whether we lost because they weren't so much of the countries they should be in I simply don't know, and I have an open mind on.
Chad,
Let me say maybe a couple things about the COVID and supply chains. I think broadly put, we're going to need to have a sort of a period of reflection and analysis to disentangle the sort of problems that arose, supply chains disruptions that were just basic demand shocks or mismatches with supply and demand versus which were really due to international trade in some respects, right? And so, you know, my sort of favorite example is obviously here in the United States, we've had at various times shortages of toilet paper. Not that we have shortages of toilet paper, but we had shortages of the toilet paper for our homes, which was suddenly all that we demanded. And that was because demand for office public space toilet paper disappeared because nobody was any longer going to the office and everybody just was staying at home, right? And so, but there was no trade involved there. This was just a demand and supply mismatch. Where trade comes in, and again, this will go to the point that I think Anne was just making. When I looked at this very early in the pandemic, it did turn out that China provided, you know, sort of more than 50% of world trade, not supply, but world trade in a lot of pieces of PPE at that time. And the problem is, and this is not just a China specific problem, is we don't have really good information in data on local production, stockpiles, consumption, to be able to know where residual supplies and capacities exist. And then when the nature of the shock, the health shock played out as it did, where it first happened in China, and it took all of sort of the world's residual supply off the market and did so in a very non-transparent way. You didn't know if these were just market forces, which it could have been doing things, or with the Chinese system, was it commands to state-owned enterprises that you may not export this stuff to any other countries, right? And this is the challenge that we have with China. This lends some credibility to, I think, the argument that states, governments are now going to kind of rethink some of this and try to pursue ways of diversification. Now, there's going to be, I think, limits and questions as to how much redundancy they want to build in. Building excess supply and excess capacity of this stuff and maintaining it is expensive to do. And so we'll have to wait and see how much tolerance there's going to be over the long term, right? Maybe in the moment while everybody's thinking about the pandemic and interest rates are zero and kind of governments can spend money and no consequence, this is what they'll be spending it on, building up sort of excess domestic supply capacity for this kind of stuff. But we'll have to see. I think, you know, aside from the United States, which has this discriminatory tariffs on Chinese stuff, the economics of this industry really do lend itself to a lot of it migrating to China for efficiency reasons. And I think there really kind of are questions about, given the nature of pandemics and shocks, and that some of these do tend to come out of China, if we're thinking about COVID or sort of H1N1, SARS, things like that, whether or not this is how we want to have the global supply of a lot of this medical equipment being distributed around the world.
Thanks. Doug, maybe
Well, I think just to build on what Chad and Ann were saying, if I could, on COVID, I think they're both right. The jury is out, but I am a little bit worried about not so much actual policy changes we've seen yet, but what the longer run implications are. So when people become afraid, they naturally tend to turn inward. And I think we're seeing a lot of statements, building on what Chad was saying, about worries about supply chains and the need to have more domestic production, whether it's efficient or not. And so when you see President Modi in India talk about make it in India, and you see re-emphasis on buy American policies, and you see even China turning inward in a sense and worried about technological innovations at home. I wonder if, like the financial crisis of 2009, after which world trade is not particularly robust and global value chains have sort of topped off, whether we're in a moment, whether it's good or bad or efficient or not, where sustaining globalization at the current high level is going to be difficult. Once again, just because attitudes change about vulnerability, and when you throw in national security as well, which is not just a concern between the US and China, but an increasing concern around the world about the fragility of alliances and the reliability of alliances. All these things, I think, tend to lead to an attitude towards turning inward. And so I think that's something I'm keeping my eye on and I worry about in coming years.
So basically, you're saying that tough times in the global economy aren't good for international trade, and we really don't know, we haven't really seen exactly what COVID is going to do. You know, I just mentioned, you know, I'm struck by the World Bank right now, you know, repeatedly keeps telling us that we should be bracing ourselves for a debt crisis in the emerging markets on a scale that we haven't seen before, that could lead to financial market difficulties and so on. So you would say that if we do have another leg down in this cycle, if unemployment stays high for a prolonged period of time, that generally hasn't been good for trade in the past.
That is certainly true, yes.
Okay.
I guess what I would say on this is, in some respects, 2020 and trade haven't turned out as bad as I think many of us feared, right? When we saw sort of the depths of the economic crisis that was hitting us back in February and March, right? And trade at that point started to fall off a cliff. And a lot of that was because it was coming out of China at the very beginning there. I think many people worried that this was going to be devastating, but in fact, you know, trade has done relatively well. It's picked up. I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is obviously, you know, we all need to have now outfitted our homes for being mini offices. And so we've now had to buy sort of all kinds of electronic equipment. You know, even typically the auto sector, which might do poorly in a downturn like this, because there's kind of shifts in people not doing public transportation anymore. There's been sort of adequate demand for automobiles that has not hurt that sector as much as might be. Now, there are some parts of trade that have been devastated, right? Services, tourism, surely. But there's all other elements, at least of goods trade, and even keeping agricultural markets open despite sort of the pandemic early in the crisis and worries about food, that haven't done that badly. And so I think there is a positive story here to tell about trade in terms of helping us get through the crisis that I think needs to be part of the narrative ultimately when we're, you know, kind of assessing what happened in 2020.
Yeah, the other thing is that you could say informally, yes, people have probably raised barriers, but just as in 2008 or 2009, 2011, you did not see in the great, you know, financial crisis, you did not see a wave of legislation or rules. I think nations chipped away is the best, it seems to me, see what my other colleagues think, chipped away at the foundations, but you didn't really see, as you might have expected, in 1931 or 32, the nations turning away. And I think that seems to be what's happening now.
Yeah, but at least on 2008, 2009, what we did get is we got United States turning away. You know, we got the whole Trump phenomenon, the whole Bernie Sanders coming into play, you know, being against globalization, being against
That was 8 years later.
Right. Well, but I mean, I think that
you could take it back to China coming into the. I mean, there are all kinds of factors that were involved there, I think. But countries as a you know, in terms of their public legislation or their public rulemaking, you really didn't see this turn away from the World Trading System, the World Trade Organization. The WTO has its own problems, but I think it was the dog that really didn't bark more than anything else.
Right. Great. I think that, you know, we're approaching the end, so it really remains for me to thank the panelists for a good discussion. And just to pick up on the last point is that it looks like there's a lot of uncertainty as to what's going to happen in the global economy, what the reactions are going to be. So it might be a good idea in 6 months' time or so to reconvene this panel and to see where we are and where the Biden administration is actually going to take trade policy. But I'm left with feel that I've learned a lot from this discussion, that there's a lot of work cut out for the Biden administration. There's a lot of stuff for them to fix, you know, to get us back on the rails towards a better international trading system, and hopefully in 6 months' time we can come back here and see that they're actually on the right track. But once again, thank you very much for joining, and I look forward to doing this again in 6 months' time.
Well, thank you for organizing this. It was an interesting discussion.
We'll all be vaccinated.
Okay, thank you.